Hey everyone, I'm Dwayne. Thank you for joining me today. So I want to talk about a gear decision that I made recently, which some of you already know about, which may seem a bit strange to make in 2025, especially in the context of where I'm coming from. So as you probably know, I use the Neural DSP Quad Cortex. I've owned it since launch, so I've owned it since 2021. Really, the unit's only come into its own the last, couple of years or so. And I use the Quad Cortex extensively for all my tone videos up until this point anyway, and I love it. It's an absolutely incredible, powerful piece of technology. There's no denying that it's one of the best modelers around at present. Obviously, it's newer, shinier, looks nice, all that stuff, blah, 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 blah. And yet, I've added this Line 6 Floor, Helix Floor to my setup. And the immediate reaction is probably why? Why buy a unit based on technology that's nearly a decade old when you already have a cutting edge modeler, the Quad Cortex? The Quad Cortex has double the Shark processors. It's got a newer shinier touchscreen interface. It looks like an Apple device, it's got captures, it's got this amazing tones out of the box. Why did you buy a Helix? And it's a fair question. And let me be absolutely clear right from the start here. This video is not saying the Quad Cortex is bad or the Helix is suddenly better. It's not a comparison video. This is not a video of why I left the Quad Cortex for the Helix, because I think both units are fantastic. I think the Quad Cortex is fantastic. I'm in love with it. 4 years of use of it, and every day I'm just blown away by it. I'm excited to use it. I love it. It sits under my desk in my study space. And as you know, if you've seen any of my other videos, I use it for all my tones, and I love interacting with it. And I've kind of worked out how to really hone the sounds on the Quad Cortex and use things and how the workflow goes and whatnot. But my reasons for bringing the Helix in and buying it go beyond just the feature list or the latest processor. Like the Helix, as I said, it's got half the amount of processing power in terms of the Shark chips that are inside of it. But it is a 10-year-old unit almost. So, of course, it's going to have slightly less powerful hardware. The Helix doesn't have a touchscreen, blah, 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 all these other things. This is really, some of the reasons are about practical workflow, how the units feel to use in different environments, long-term usability factors, establishment of the ecosystem, support, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to get into that. So interestingly, the thing that I find most fascinating about the Helix is that it's still widely considered a direct competitor and benchmark in the prosumer space of modeling, even without certain features that every other pedal, like even $500 pedals now have, capturing functionality. Like the Tone X, there's the Moore pedal, which was just recently released a little while ago, which also has capture functionality. Feels like everyone has a pedal that has capture functionality now. Credit where credit is due. The Kemper had capturing 15 years ago. And you can still buy the Kemper as well, and it still sounds amazing. There's bands still using it, but I think it's interesting that the Helix is still selling well. It's still used, even though it doesn't have some of these new fancy pants features that the other modelers kind of have. So I think the neural capture functionality is brilliant, but if you're like me, you didn't buy the Quad Cortex specifically for capturing. You bought it because it sounded amazing. You bought it for the promise of plug-in compatibility and all that kind of other stuff. But I think credit where credit is due. I think Neural DSP pushed amp modeling further. They did that in the software world first with their plugins. And a lot of the people that bought the Quad Cortex bought it because the plug-in compatibility was promised and people knew the neural stuff sounded amazing. A lot of bands before the Quad Cortex was even released, they were recording albums with the plugins, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And bands, guitarists recording guitars on albums using software plugins. Well, I guess it's not really crazy when you think about people using, Line 6 modeling gear from, ages ago, like the Kidney Bean, the Line 6 modelers and all that kind of stuff, bands like Periphery and Tesseract and all that kind of stuff, those early progressive metal bands that were pioneering digital amp modeling were using these really kind of limited devices, but they were really making them sound really good. So I think the Quad Cortex sounds amazing. The amp modeling is top tier. It's one of the best modelers in this space alongside, the Fractal FM9, the Helix, all that kind of stuff, that has the processing power to kind of really just max out the lanes on this thing. And the compact size of it, it's tiny. It's like the size of a MacBook Pro, right? Like it's not a big device compared to some of the other stuff. And as I said, I think the capturing functionality is good if capturing is a feature that you want. But like I said, I've actually never used the capture functionality. I don't have any analog equipment. I've been in the digital space for a long time now. I sold all my equipment years ago and I never looked back. So for me personally, while captures are impressive, they aren't an important part of my use of modelers. I find the built-in amp modeling effects in the Helix and the Quad Cortex are incredibly strong. Really you have to get really picky to kind of really, in terms of amp modeling and stuff like that, to say one is better than the other. I will say the Quad Cortex does sound better out of the box without tweaking. It's one of those modelers. It was the first modeler where I turned it on, started playing, and I was like, wow, I didn't have to EQ anything. Things just kind of responded nicely. I didn't have to download impulse responses or anything like that. It just worked. And the Helix can do that, but I do find the Helix does require a little bit more finesse and tweaking to kind of get it to that point, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because the Helix does give you more ability to tweak your sounds. Obviously, you can alter the sag and bias and hum and all that kind of stuff that the Quad Cortex doesn't let you do. My decision wasn't driven by any lack of core tone quality on the Quad Cortex or power, obviously, because really, as I said, compare them, the Quad Cortex is more powerful. It's more about other factors that become more apparent when you start looking at these units not in the context of a studio environment and you look at them in the real world. For me, workflow is a massive factor. And while the Quad Cortex's touchscreen is powerful and fast for many things, I found that I don't use the touchscreen really on the Quad Cortex anymore. When I first got it, I did because there was no software to interact with it. So I had to kind of annoyingly have it up on my desk, which meant I couldn't stomp on it to change scenes. If you go back and look at some of my early videos that I did on YouTube, there's actually pauses in there because I'm actually having to physically go in and hit the foot switches on there to change over, which is quite funny in hindsight because I could have just edited that stuff out, but you're kind of working the stuff out. So for me, touchscreen is nice in the Quad Cortex, but it's not a feature that I would say makes it better than the Helix or anything else, because a lot of the time you're not interacting with this unit. You're creating your presets, setting up your scenes and snapshots, whatever you're doing. On the Quad Cortex, obviously scenes. Once you set the stuff up, if you're performing live, you're not down on the floor dragging and dropping and creating things. You're stomping on it, or it's in the back in a rack getting controlled by MIDI pretty much. But it's largely like the workflow of these things. You're kind of building your presets in the confine of a studio space, right? Unless you're the kind of person who lives on the edge and is creating your presets live on stage in front of the audience, then more power to you. But yeah, that's definitely not something that I'm going to be doing. I do like the fact that on the Helix, there's more tactile knobs and buttons, and I'm an old school guy. I like navigating through menus and pressing buttons. Like I drive a Land Cruiser, and even though it does have a touch screen, I like the fact that my vehicle has tactile buttons for everything, like the air conditioning, and that isn't controlled through a touchscreen iPad interface. That's obviously a personal preference for me. But I do like that about the Helix. It's a little bit more old school in that it's got knobs and dials and buttons and dedicated foot switches and all that kind of stuff. That kind of where you can see it happening and not necessarily just kind of drag around on a soulless touchscreen. But I don't think those are really selling points for either device. They're preferences, right? We should probably talk about the ergonomics underfoot. On the Helix, space between the foot switches is really forgiving. Like It's obviously double the width of the Quad Cortex, if not even wider. I haven't measured it, but the Helix Floor is like, it's this massive, fridge-like device. It's a tank, right? It's not a tiny little boutique MacBook Pro looking device, but one important thing, as I said, is I find the space between the foot switches is really, really good. And honestly, find me a long-term Quad Cortex user who hasn't accidentally stepped on the wrong rotary stomp, because, for as powerful as the Quad Cortex is in its small form factor, the downside to that is the space between the foot switches on the Quad Cortex. I wouldn't say it's half the distance of the Helix, but it's considerable. The distance is enough that if you're up on stage and it's dark and you're tapping around, you don't want to have to be worrying about, am I going to accidentally hit the wrong scene and go from a clean tone to a heavy tone, or a heavy tone to clean tone. Like if you're in a metal band and you're chugging and then you accidentally, go to add more gain or something, or an effect, you go to the clean, it's going to sound terrible, right? So yeah, find me a Quad Cortex user who has used this on the floor in a stomp fashion, who hasn't accidentally hit the wrong rotary stomp, because that to me is something I think is just universal amongst everyone with the Quad Cortex, is that space is very cramped and you really have to kind of learn to train your foot to kind of tap on it. You can't really wear like big boots when you're using it. You really have to be mindful. And I think in terms of the Helix and the foot switches, like from a playability perspective, the Helix is a lot less riskier. Like I'm sure you could probably make a mistake on the Helix still if you're not paying attention. It's definitely a lot less likely. And I guess leading on to that as well, another Helix feature that I think just absolutely nails, like in terms of ergonomics on a stage, especially a dark stage, is the scribble strip. So obviously these little LCD screens that sit above each foot stomp. Maybe for some of you, that's not really a feature that you care about. But if you're on a dark stage, those scribble strips don't just show you what those particular foot switches are doing. They also are providing light as well. And the Quad Cortex does have light. It's got little LEDs that kind of go across the top. And I've got little clear mushroom toppers that go on top of the rotary stomps as well, which light up. And that kind of does help you see, because you can color code them. But I find the scribble strips, they throw a lot of light. And I think light is a very underrated thing as a performer, especially in dark, dingy spaces where there's no fancy stage lights or anything like that. Or, if you're playing an environment where the lights are more kind of, I guess, theatrical and orchestrated, and then they're flashing, and, there's moments where they go dark or they kind of focuses on one part. The scribble strips are light. They're not just labels to show you what they are light. And I think that is a hugely underrated thing, and something that I really love about the Helix is the scribble strips. And if you talk to anyone that owns a Helix and has owned one for a while, they're going to rave about the scribble strips as well, because I think it is a very underrated thing that they did, and really smart, really clever as well. So as I was saying before, I think having knobs for the different parameters like amp controls and effects levels, allowing quick sort of muscle memory adjustments without looking down or navigating the menus, it's a different feel. Like you can do that with the rotary stomps, but I find because the rotary stomps on the Quad Cortex aren't aligning with what you see on the screen, you have to train your brain to know, okay, well, this one here is controlling this. And it's because there's less knobs on the Quad Cortex, obviously. It's a smaller device. The Helix, it has, obviously on the screen, under the bottom, like on the amp I've got open at the moment, I've got drive, bass, mid, treble, presence, and channel volume knobs that I can adjust. And that is a really huge underrated feature. But as I said, if you're not adjusting these things on the fly, it doesn't actually really matter, in my opinion. Okay, now we're going to talk about the build, the roadworthiness, and the precious factor of the Quad Cortex and the Line 6 Helix. So this might sound like a bit of a weird thing to say, but the Quad Cortex almost feels too nice for the floor. I don't know how to describe it. Like my MacBook Pro, like MacBook Pro is considered like the standard of nice laptop computers, right? Like it's powerful, but it also looks distinctive and beautiful. And I take good care of my Apple equipment because it's so damn expensive to replace. But because it's got brushed aluminium and all that stuff, it shows up scuffs and marks. So I wouldn't go putting my MacBook Pro onto a concrete floor or pushing it around or throwing it. I'm always putting it somewhere safe. I'm always mindful of drinks and stuff. I'm always putting it in a case when I'm going out and about with it. And to me, the Quad Cortex it's a beautifully designed piece of tech, but that design includes a large central touchscreen. It's got the same MacBook-esque brushed aluminium, and it just feels a little bit too pretty, as I was saying. Like, it doesn't look like a device that you would put on the floor and just stomp with your disgusting, sticky, beer-dirty feet. Like, it seems like a device you would have up on like a nice fancy bookshelf or something. And when you think about it, it's kind of like you wouldn't eat like a bag of Cheetos and then go typing on your $3,000 MacBook Pro and discoloring the keys and getting Cheeto dust in there. Same thing with the Quad Cortex. I mean, that's how I feel anyway. And maybe that's a me problem, but yeah, it just feels too nice to just throw on the floor. And think about it, when you look at the Quad Cortex being used by major artists, there's some really big heavy hitters using it now. There's Sleep Token, North Lane, you've got Architects, a whole bunch of different artists are using this. But if you actually see when they're playing with it live, at least to my knowledge anyway, and what I've seen, it's frequently tucked away safely in a rack backstage. It's in a drawer. It's nicely secured. It's away from anything. It's being controlled remotely by a MIDI. You don't see those bands stomping on it and controlling it and using that like a floor modeler, which is how it's been designed. And really, when you bought it, that was the only way you could use it because it was really kind of rather limited in what it could do at the time. Now, people do that with the Helix rack too. Obviously, there's a Helix in a rack form. But when you see, we're comparing the Helix Floor here. So when you see the Helix Floor unit being used, it's taking the abuse right on the stage under the guitarist's feet. So a good example of an artist that comes to mind is Dustin Kensrue from the band Thrice. One of my favorite bands of all time, but we're sort of fangirl video. But whenever I've seen Thrice play, and I've seen them a few times, Dustin has been using the Helix basically since it launched. It's on the stage. He's stomping on it. He's changing between the scenes. He hasn't got a sound guy changing it by MIDI. There's no backing track that's kind of triggering it, even though he could do that. He's up there. He's just abusing it on stage. He's not being precious about it. And I see that quite often when I see the Helix being used, the Helix Floor, especially in a worship context. You don't go to church on a Sunday and see a guitarist. Most likely they are using a Helix 9 times out of 10. It's that common. You don't see them just playing while it's automatically being triggered by backing tracks. They're actually stomping and changing things as they go. And I think that's the perception of Line 6 equipment as a whole, and it's always been, is the reality of it is their stuff is built like a tank. Like, it's like Boss pedals. You can get a Boss pedal from the 90s, the 80s, and those things are solid. Like, you could throw a Boss pedal at someone and do some serious damage, and those things just don't die. And it's the same with the Line 6 equipment. Like, even predating the Helix, you can go get a HD 500X, sorry, or even like the old kidney bean modelers, and they're still working. And those things are built like tanks. Like, they can take a lot of abuse. They can take spills, they can take stomping, being dropped. Not that most people are that clumsy with their equipment. The thing I think with Line 6 stuff is if an accident happens, it's least likely going to break it. There's a possibility everything can break, but I feel like the Line 6 stuff from that perspective, it's seen more as like tank-like. Obviously, it's a lot heavier, it's a lot bigger to carry compared to a Quad Cortex, but it's definitely more sturdy. And I think that leads directly to this point I've been trying to make in a roundabout way. I find myself generally more anxious using the Quad Cortex in an unpredictable gig environment. As I said, I haven't really taken the Quad Cortex out of this room. In the last few years, I haven't really played live. If I did take that out, I would be pretty nervous about it because I look at the Quad Cortex and I think the screen is a magnet for damage. A dropped mic, like a microphone is pretty heavy, they're weighty things. Drop that on the touchscreen, it's probably gone. A spilled drink like a beer or something like that, an audience member throws something onto the stage, clumsy bandmate tripping over you, a rogue strap falling off and a guitar dropping on it, or even just my own boot hitting it wrong. That stuff worries me on the Quad Cortex like quite a lot. These are factors I don't have to worry about at home in the studio environment, but out in the real world, like there's hazards that are unavoidable. Mistakes happen. No one's intentionally trying to damage their equipment or mistreat it, but it's just the nature of the beast. Accidents happen, things that you can't see if you're playing outside. It could be a hailstorm, it could be a rainstorm, all these other factors that I think when it comes to the two devices, if I were to say what would be more likely to survive a storm, it's probably a Helix compared to a Quad Cortex. And I know with the Quad Cortex, there's aftermarket for screen protectors, which many do. I don't because I'm really taking it outside just yet. But I think it highlights that kind of level of protection should be integrated from the factory. Like I'm sure the screen is actually probably pretty strong. I don't know what the glass is made from, but I just know from experience with glass that even the strongest glass will break. There's always that risk that something would damage it. It's a touch screen as well. So if it gets damaged, the touch screen is gone, or it looks terrible, whatever other factors could affect the usability of it. It seems weird to me that for a device that has been designed as a floor unit, because like I said, when it launched, it didn't have an editor or anything like that. It had the drag and drop touchscreen functionality, which kind of made up for it. But it's a floor unit, but it's got some stuff on there that I think puts it at risk compared to a Helix. I'm not saying it's weak. I'm not saying that people aren't out there abusing the Quad Cortex, and it's fine because that's the possibility. I guess the anxiety comes from I just don't know. Like I just look at it. I see the vents on the side. I see the touch screen. I see the space between the main volume knob. I see all that kind of stuff, and I think water, liquid, dropping things on there. It's either going to damage it or it's just going to like scuff it up and look absolutely terrible because it's a brushed aluminium device. So I find with the Helix, I just have less background anxiety about it surviving the rigors of regular gigging and traveling. I don't care if I put this on a plane and the guys throwing the luggage onto the plane, which you'll see they do. They kind of sometimes just throw it into the plane. And obviously I have a case for the Quad Cortex, which protects it. It's the official Quad Cortex case. But I think if they were doing that to a Helix, despite the fact I'd be like, why are they throwing my equipment in there? I would just have I would feel better knowing that it's more protected. It's like this big metal tank. It's gonna take an absolute beating. Now, if people are getting a hammer and smashing these devices, nothing's gonna survive that. But I would say in that context, if you're hitting these with a hammer, the Helix is probably going to die last just because of the way that it's being built, just how sturdy it is. Yeah, not that anyone would be doing that, and I don't encourage you to be doing that because that's just a waste of money. But yeah, it's a weird comparison to make, but I think the Helix would survive a hammer longer than a Quad Cortex would. The next thing we're going to talk about, I think, is the sound palette and the flavors on there, which really it's a less of an issue, in my opinion, between the two devices. But I think sound is critical, and both units are capable of world-class tones. Like, for example, there's bands that have been using the Helix since it launched. Really good example, again, is Thrice. They actually have been using the Helix for all their amp tones and effects for the last few albums that they've put out. Dustin, obviously the frontman of Thrice, just records using his Helix devices. And I don't think he really uses any analog pedals with it. So if you go listen to a Thrice record released in the last 9 years, they've actually used the Helix for those tones. And I can't tell the difference between that and a real amp, and most people can't in a mix. They definitely have different voices. Line 6 has spent decades, developing its own amp models and effects. And maybe more significantly, I'd say on the effects front, they've got a huge library of effects. So they've got their own original effects that aren't direct clones of classic pedals, more inspired, but then they've also got the classic effects on there. And I think that that is a big deal in the context of sounds. But if you're just a simple person that's doing metalcore, like what do you need? You need a high gain amp and an overdrive pedal, maybe a reverb and a noise gate. But really, there are people out there that don't need much. And I think the effects in that regard don't matter because both units on a core level, the basic effects are good. But I think Line 6 is they've definitely invested more time and effort into the effects side, which is probably why it has become such a popular unit for worship players, I would say. Now, talking about the effects, like I said, some people don't care about having a huge library of effects. There are certain flavors, specific delay algorithms, lush reverbs, there's wacky synth sounds, there's all these unique modulation effects on there. And even some of the, original Line 6 amp models that they make themselves, they're just distinctively Helix. Like you can hear things and that's like, okay, I don't hear that on any other device. I don't hear that on a Quad Cortex. And I don't think it's about one being objectively better, but I think the Helix, you just have access, at least currently anyway, in its current form, you have access to a more diverse sonic palette. If you're, for example, doing shoegaze, I would probably say the Helix is a better unit for shoegaze. Even though it doesn't have as much power, you can create much more lush reverb, delay, modulated sounds that are associated with the genre like that than you could on the Quad Cortex, because the Quad Cortex has some work to do on the reverb front that I think the Helix just objectively does better. But sometimes a specific, Line 6 effect is just the sound I'm hearing in my head. And having it available is just a huge creative advantage. But once again, you can do a lot with the Quad Cortex and really, you're nitpicking at the end of the day if you're saying, well, the Helix has more effects. Well, it does, but they're not necessarily always better. But I do think the Helix does reverbs a lot better than the Quad Cortex. And it's something that I've been wanting Neural to actually fix this for a very long time now. The reverb situation, the delays are fine, but I think the reverb situation definitely needs some work, especially if you're comparing it to the Helix. And that right there is just a software problem. It's not a hardware thing, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about now, when we're talking about amp modeling and stuff, is really just software. As I said, the hardware is the computer. It determines how much of the software you can run and what the software can do. But more powerful hardware does not mean that the software gets better. You can have powerful hardware, crappy software, or you can have good software, crappy hardware, and they both will limit each other in different aspects. So yeah, I definitely don't think that's a sticking point. I just wanted to bring that up because I definitely think the Helix effects as a whole are better, but I do think the Quad Cortex does certain things just as well too. So it's definitely not really any kind of noticeable downside there. Now, another big thing that I do think where they really start to divide here is the philosophy around the ecosystem. And the way that Neural decided to go with the Quad Cortex and the way that Line 6 went with the Helix. And it's a really significant point for me, but it may not matter to you. So the Quad Cortex is really heavily integrated with the cloud for discovering and sharing presets, for backups, all that kind of stuff. Everything goes through their centralized cloud, which obviously requires an internet connection. So if you want to do a backup, you can't just save a backup to a file and put that onto a USB drive or into a Dropbox. It actually has to go to Neural servers. So of course, that to me, as I'm a programmer, so to me, that immediately raises some red flags of what happens if their servers go down, what happens if they have a cyber attack and my backups get lost. All these kind of things, you're relying on Neural to have their stuff in order. And to put it bluntly, I don't think they do. I think Neural has really spread themselves so thin because their team is obviously smaller. They've got plugin compatibility to worry about that's taken forever because of, the architectural complexities around that, the software side of that, which I do understand, and I'm not putting them down for that. But I do think Neural has really they've shot themselves in the foot a little bit of not having a dedicated file format for the Quad Cortex, whereas the Helix, obviously, you can have preset files, right? There's no cloud reliance on the Helix. I can be completely offline and I can have access to everything I need. If I need to restore a backup on my Helix for whatever reason, and I'm playing some regional show, for example, and there's no internet for whatever reason, which would probably be rare these days, but still a possibility, and I need my backup to kind of restore it for whatever reason, I would most likely have that. I would have that on a USB drive or something, and just quickly plug in my computer in and do that, and I would have a backup. But I think that reliance of being online is actually a liability, and that walled garden approach has never sat entirely comfortable with me, especially for critical features like backups and stuff. I think that's just a huge misstep. I would love to have a .qc file I could drag into the editor and just upload straight onto the device. I don't know why they did that. I suspect it's related to they didn't want people to use that as an in to jailbreak their device, or they just wanted to control everything like Apple does. It seems like they've taken inspiration from Apple in many regards, because Apple is also a walled garden ecosystem. But yeah, what if you want to archive your entire live set from a tour onto a simple physical backup medium like a USB drive? And the Helix isn't the only established modeler that uses straightforward preset files and backup files and stuff. There's other modelers that allow this, that don't wall garden it, because at the end of the day, who wants to maintain more infrastructure for this stuff? Neural are just increasing their costs and maintenance and developer capability resources are being dedicated to maintaining all this stuff, and I just don't think it's needed. Like, I love the fact on the Helix, so I can just send a Helix preset file to a bandmate or a tech, as I said, manage multiple backups easily, and just be self-sufficient. I like having control over things. I'm a huge staunch proponent of open source software, and I just think these kind of things are very anti-consumer in a way. Now, obviously, I've never had issues with the Quad Cortex, but I have a really good internet connection at home, and those concerns have never really come to the forefront of my mind that stopped me from using that particular device. But these are things that I guess if you're a touring musician, they are definitely valid concerns, and I think things that people should worry about more with the Quad Cortex than they probably should. Most people, I don't think, care that the Quad Cortex relies on the cloud, but I do. But at the end of the day, I use it for the sounds and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where I kind of at the end of the day, I just look away, right? Where does this leave me with the two high-end modelers in terms of studio usage versus stage unit? It's actually resulted in a very clear and logical division of labor in my setup. The way I see it for me now is the Quad Cortex is the studio powerhouse. It's incredible audio quality, the processing power, the compact desk footprint, because my wife hates the fact that I have all this stuff around, and she likes it. She calls it cute because it's a small device. It doesn't take up much space, whereas the Helix, obviously it's dominating the space that it's in. But I think the Quad Cortex, the form factor, the sounds, the capture functionality, yeah, it's useful to have even if you don't use it daily. But it's nice to know if I ever wanted to capture a boutique amp or pedal that I have access to, that I could do that. And I've thought about many times just going and hiring some boutique equipment and then capturing it and just taking it back, which sounds fun to me, but I've never done that. I think it's the perfect device for detailed sound design, recording sessions, reamping, and really any situation where it can be kept in a controlled, safe environment, which as I said before, this is why you see a lot of bands playing live. They're actually not using it as a floor modeler. They're not stomping on it. It's neatly tucked away in these, rack drawers, and a lot of them are using 2 or 3 of these with redundancy as well, because I guess for other touring artists, there is an anxiety around having it on the floor, and also the reliability aspect of it, because it's not as established. But I think the Quad Cortex is good. And that leads me to the Line 6 Floor. So to me, this is the touring and live workhorse. It's got a bomb-proof construction. It's got more forgiving Footswitch layout for live playing, so you're not accidentally switching between snapshots accidentally. It's got nice tactile control. It's got more knobs and stuff to play with. It's got the vast effects library. As I was saying, it's got the single file presets that you have access to. And I'm going to say it again because I think it's worth repeating. The scribble strips are they are unrivaled. They are such an underrated feature. that if you own the Quad Cortex, you've never used the Helix. You use the Helix, you're like, wow, I wish the Quad Cortex had scribble strips. And obviously it can't because it's too small, but it's one thing, I just love it. Like, especially from a light perspective, it is absolutely amazing. But I just definitely think at the end of the day, to summarize that, the Quad Cortex is a studio device. It's really good from just recording, reamping, whatever. You can tour with it, but if you're not a band that has, rack mounting and capability to really orchestrate your live shows with MIDI controlling between scenes and backing tracks and stuff, you're in a cover band, you don't have that stuff. You're playing in a small club or bar or whatever on a, crappy PA system. Those environments can be a little bit like rough and the floors are dirty and things are a little bit more dangerous, I think, for a Quad Cortex. But once again, I think the Quad Cortex would be fine. I'm just saying those anxieties weighed on me enough that when I decided I'm going to be starting to play live again, I immediately made the decision, okay, I'm going to have to get something that I don't want to have to worry about when I'm playing live. I don't want it to be like, is this thing going to break? Is it going to, if something drops on this, is it just going to destroy it? And as I said, that's a possibility between any device, but the Helix, I think, less so. So I think the Helix really is kind of, it's the live device. It may not sound as good plug and play, but if you're playing live, you're pre-planning all your presets and scenes and playlists and all that kind of stuff. You're not building the stuff on the fly, so you have time to really put in the work to make it sound good. I think at the end of the day, that extra sort of reliability aspect, it's just really, it's unrivaled, I think. And I think it's like a small niche thing as well, because understandably some of you, including myself primarily, are bedroom players. And like I said, for someone using this in a room, I'm using the Quad Cortex most of the time. My tone recreation videos, as you may see on my channel, if you've seen any, they are using the Quad Cortex because this thing is just a workhorse. I love how it sounds. I love the workflow. I love the software. The Helix is a little bit more work, but ultimately you can both get them to sound the same, in my opinion. The differences are very negligible in terms across the spectrum, especially in a mix through a crappy PA system. At the end of the day, what's going to determine how good these sound is how good your playing is. I can't remember who said it, but that saying is tone comes from the fingers, right? You can give a pro musician a crappy guitar and a crappy amp, and they can just really make it sound really good. Like a Tim Henson could make a really cheap broken guitar and amp actually sound great. But if I went and used Tim Henson's rig or Pliny's rig or whatever, and being the mediocre player that I am, it's going to sound terrible no matter how good their equipment is and their guitar is, because really tone does come from how you play. So we're gonna wrap this video up here because I feel like we're kind of going in circles a little bit. But that's kind of the reason that I bought the Helix. I'm just really confident and comfortable in the ecosystem. I'm really comfortable and confident with the reliability and the construction of the device. I loved how it looks. Sure, it may not have a touch screen. It may not have, some of the more ergonomic functionality and features of the Quad Cortex. It doesn't have capturing. You may have to use IRs to make it sound, decent in some contexts, but I just think it's amazing that the Helix is 10 years old and it's just in the conversation in 2025. And there's no Helix 2 in sight because Line 6 just keep improving this thing. And I think at the end of the day, that's the distinction, as I've pointed out a couple of times in this video, you have to make, is that at the end of the day, it's the software. It's not the hardware. As I said before, the hardware determines what the software can do. But really, the software, you can just continuously update this stuff. Sure, it might mean over time you can't have 20 reverbs and 20 delays and 20 overdrives and run 15 amps at the same time. Or, the Quad Cortex can run multiple instruments at the same time. Most people playing this stuff are just one guitarist running into one rig, and they're not doing a whole lot of stuff. I think they're both just really good for that. So it's not about ditching new for old. It's not about declaring one of these a winner. It's just a pragmatic decision driven by my anxiety, workflow preferences, the concerns about the roadworthiness, and really kind of having access, I guess, to more sonic flavors that the Helix offers. And really, I guess, also, as petty as it sounds, that independent file-based ecosystem that the Helix has, I think is a really huge plus as well. So The Helix, even as it approaches veteran status, remains a compelling, robust sounding platform that sounds as relevant in 2025 as it did in 2015. And I think this thing's got years left in it. Even if they did release a Helix 2 tomorrow, I think at the end of the day, it's probably going to be backwards compatible. It's probably going to largely sound the same. It just might have a different interface. It might have more power. Well, it would. I would be surprised they released a new device that was less powerful or the same. But really, the hardware, it just determines what you can do, right? But I think the Quad Cortex remains an unbelievable tool that's suited for the studio, at least in my workflow anyway. And I think the ultimate setup isn't about having the newest, shiniest object. I think we get so caught up in that a new iPhone comes out every year and we feel that we have to upgrade when, what does it do? Like maybe you get an extra megapixel of camera quality, or they change the design of it. But, at the end of the day, these incremental leaps in technology don't happen every year. In the AMP modeling world, they definitely don't happen every year. They happen over the span of decades. Absolutely. It's just unbelievable to me that the AMP modeling world, despite being, they're replicating real equipment, it just doesn't move as fast, and it doesn't have to, because you can go to Line 6 device predating the Helix, as I said earlier, and it still sounds good. Like, you can just put it into a mix and it sounds amazing. But I think it's just choosing the right tools for the right job, right? Like, at least in the terms of your needs, and not about what's the newest thing, because the Helix is not a device that's incapable of doing a lot of the things the Quad Cortex can do. Quad Cortex, sure, can take multiple instruments. You can have a guitarist and a bassist playing through it. You can run dual amps or quad amps if you want to. You can stack things. You can do things that you can't do on the Helix. But at the end of the day, most people aren't doing that level of soundscaping because, most tones are quite simple at the end of the day, really. Most genres are not complicated, and anyone pushing the forefront of that power, I would say, is intentionally doing it. So I'm generally interested to hear what you think. Does this resonate with any of you? If you own the Quad Cortex, do you worry about taking it out, or is it just a me problem? Is this just an unfounded insecurity and the Quad Cortex is fine? Are you the kind of person that is okay taking it into a CD bar or a rogue beer bottle or a microphone or whatever may, land on it and possibly damage it? Do you even care about the cloud functionality versus, local file management? I don't know if that influences a lot of people, but it does me. But I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm always interested in how people see this equipment. You see a lot of people talking about the Quad Cortex especially, and they talk about how amazing it sounds, and they talk about how new it is and how powerful it is and the capture functionality. You don't really hear anyone talk about the construction and the anxiety around actually using this in the real world. So I would love your thoughts in the comments below. And if you don't have any comments, then that's fine too. So if you found my thoughts and perspective on these devices useful or interesting, I would really appreciate a thumbs up and you subscribing. I'm not going to be making videos like this all the time. Primarily, I'm doing tone recreation videos and showing you how to use this stuff. But I do appreciate the support because I'm trying to grow this. And I'm not doing it to make this my job, but it would be nice to get to a point where more people can see this stuff, and I can just get better at it because I have a bit of more of incentive to push this content out, but I do it because I love it. So I appreciate you watching to this end of this video. If you got to this point, put up with the rambling, and I thank you so much for watching, and stay safe out there, and hopefully I will catch you in the next video. See you later.